Great to be here. So I think for today's talk, I think I could just focus on the high level state of the Bitcoin ecosystem and the builders coming to this ecosystem. So in general, I think 2023 is a very, very special year because it is a revival of builders coming back to Bitcoin. And I think that is something that I cannot be more excited about. And it really started with Ordinals, right? Like it's Ordinals is still just months old, like not even like 6 months old, and that was the spark where it sort of like clicked for people that you can build other interesting things on Bitcoin. And I think there are two aspects to it. One is technical. There was this sort of like misconception out there that Bitcoin is just payments and just a store of value, and there aren't any things you can build on it. And secondly, I do think it was a cultural thing as well, that whenever people are coming up with like new innovative things, any experiments, whatever they're doing over the last like many years since the block size wars really from 2017, I think the Bitcoin dominant culture, it got dominated by a lot of non-technical people who are very, very, very conservative on the one end of like, even more fundamental in certain ways. And that culture was actually pushing developers away, right? So I think 2023 was very special. It doesn't mean that, no developers were around. Obviously, people building in the Stacks ecosystem or Rootstock, Lightning, which is sort of still liked even in the extreme circles. Like these projects were around, they were sort of like building, but I'm talking about mainstream crypto industry, right? Like I often give this example that I would go to, typical crypto events and I'll be sitting at a dinner and people would introduce me as like, hey, here's Muneeb. He's the last person building on Bitcoin, and people would laugh, right? And they would laugh partly because it was sort of true, right? And funny, like nobody else was there building on Bitcoin. And I think that's changing, and I think that's very, very healthy. So what I expect now with the Ordinals movement is that because the culture has changed as well, like I'm seeing, for example, early stage VC funds who would give me a call asking about some input on their first check that they're writing on a Bitcoin startup, and it really, really makes me happy to see that happen, because I haven't seen that in the last 4 or 5 years, where typical investors are sort of like on their own. I think that's organic. On their own, they're getting interested in Bitcoin. They want to have exposure to startups and builders who are actually doing interesting things around Bitcoin. And it's sort of like clicking that this is a underappreciated market. It's potentially a pretty large market. And people are taking it much more seriously. Same for builders. Like I'm having conversations with folks who are building on Solana or Ethereum, and they're sort of like putting two and two together and figuring out that the highest ROI for their time and attention right now could actually be on Bitcoin, because in many ways, it's early. It's very, very early on the Bitcoin side. So popping up a level, I think that 2017, I think a lot of things go back to 2017. 2017 is the year where Ethereum went from being just an experiment to something that is gaining real developer traction, right? So CryptoKitties and stuff, it really sort of like almost like exhausted the L1 capacity. And they started doing a bunch of research on, hey, are L2s going to work? Is L1 scaling going to work? Or are there going to be other faster L1s, right? So if you look at the last bull market, what we saw was there were a bunch of experiments, mostly in the fast L1 space, right? The Solanas and the Avalanche and Algorands of the world, they come to mind. Great teams that they've done interesting work. But a lot of people are realizing that L2s are sort of like underappreciated. And now there's a lot of interest and momentum towards Ethereum L2s, because these separate L1 networks are sort of like realizing that it's very hard building a large capital base like how Bitcoin and maybe even Ethereum already has, or building a large community around it. Whereas with L2s, you're building on an existing system, right? So if you look at Arbitrum or Optimism, they're building on an existing ecosystem of Ethereum. People can easily move ETH capital into these L2s, and that sort of like makes sense, right? So there's now, in my view, more interest in Ethereum L2s compared to what we saw last cycle. And I think, sure, these faster L1s might be around, and some of them might be successful, but in general, I think people are gravitating more towards, look, these established networks are the place to be. And Bitcoin is, like, on Ethereum, these L2s are something like $40-50 billion market. On Bitcoin, they're less than 2 billion. And I think Stacks is something like 80% of it right now, followed by Rootstock and then others. And so it's very early days. Yes, if you are building here, you should expect that there will be infrastructure challenges. There will be, those early growing pains. But on the other side of it, there's a potentially large opportunity that is early. So I think that's sort of like my main message as we are looking into Bitcoin halving next April, as we're looking into what's happening on the L1 with the gas fees going up. I think there's a ton of opportunity, and if you're a builder, like this might be the right time to come in and start exploring the Bitcoin side.